Well, good afternoon, everybody. I should say good afternoon, but good morning or good evening or wherever you are, because we have attendees from all over the world, but I hope you're well. I hope you managed to join us this morning for an outstanding session. Fantastic speakers, riveting topic of conversation. And this afternoon, we have some great speakers for you too. The afternoon is set into two parts. So the first part, which will last for approximately half an hour, is on the role of Nardos in recreational sport and where we ought to draw the line. And this morning we had a lot of questions about the scope of anti-doping policy, the proportionality of its application, the context sensitivity of judgments, given that the original purpose for anti-doping regulations was restricted to the elite sphere. So these questions are going to come up in relationship now to the role of Nados, and I'm pleased to welcome Herman Ram, who is the president of the Netherlands Anti-Doping Authority, Dr. Lucien Attard, who is president of the Maltese Anti-Doping Committee. But first, to kick us off from the world of sport federations, we have Stephen Watkins, who is the anti-doping program manager of the Rugby Football Union in the UK. Over to you, Stephen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all see my slides now. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Look, coming from you to live from my kitchen. So I'm the Rugby Football Union's Anti-Doping and Illicit Drugs Programme Manager. It's a role I've held since 2010. I've overseen more than 50 anti-doping rule violations, and I've educated over 200 sessions with community and recreational players. So hopefully I can give you a good perspective on recreational sport. Just as a little bit of background on the Rugby Football Union in England, we're one of the biggest unions in the world. We have over 1,800 clubs, not far off 300,000 regular players. Only 1% of those players are in fact from our elite population. So the vast majority fall under the recreational tag. We have an incredibly well-funded and very supportive NADO, as well as our international federation. So great working relationship with both organizations. And something we all have in common is that drug use of any kind in our sport, whether it's performance enhancing, illicit drugs or image enhancing drugs, is not something that we want. It harms the reputation of our sport, but it also can damage the participant numbers that are drawn to the sport that are so crucial for us to grow the game. I think in answer to the question, what role do Nados play in recreational sport? And it came up earlier in this morning's topics. Each sport is very different as to what recreational looks like. And I think before I can answer the main topic of this afternoon's presentation, it's really important that I try to get across to you what recreational sport in English Rugby Union is. And when Mike asked me to do this talk, I thought, right, that's really straightforward. And then I started to put these slides together and realized, actually, recreational sport as a definition in English Rugby Union is not as straightforward as you think. It effectively starts at level 12, which is very much beginner and school age, and can go right up into the semi-professional game, right up into level 2. So you can have in English Rugby Union professional players playing alongside recreational and social players. So it's really not an easy definition to necessarily have. I think the other question that it is worth trying to answer before we get into the sort of main topic is, what's the point? Why do we need to have our Nardos looking at recreational sport? Surely they're only here really for the elite sport environment. And hopefully the next slide will give you some reason as to why we absolutely need our Nardos focused on this area. As I said earlier, I've been in this role since 2010, overseen over 50 rule violations, dealt with many, many matters here. And you can tell from my slide, 30 of the matters that I've dealt with have been in recreational sport. They've not all involved performance and image enhancing drugs, lots of them have involved illicit drug use. And in the sort of 10 years from the 90s to 2001, it was very clear from a lot of the researchers out there, actually, image and performance enhancing drug use in society has gone up. And therefore, it shouldn't necessarily really be a surprise that that has crept into our sport environment. So absolutely crucial to have a Nardo playing a role in tackling image, performance and illicit drug use within our recreational sporting landscape. So to try and answer for you today what we see in English Rugby Union as the role of the Nardo in recreational sport, very much similar lines to Kelsey from USA Cycling. We see primarily the role to be an educational one. It's crucial that athletes at all levels feel supported, as well as support staff to those athletes feel supported in clean sport. They understand the rules, the regulations, but that's quite a complicated and difficult kind of regime to get your head around. Underpinning some of that, though, has to be some testing to a small degree. And to give you one of the concerns that was raised at a club with myself a couple of years ago, hypodermic needles from an anabolic steroid user were found in a changing room. The RFU and UK Anti-Doping investigated. We identified who we thought the athletes were. We target tested them. We managed to remove them from the game, obviously, for a significant period of time. And then we did a lot of work with the club to try and educate around the values of the game, as well as why we don't need performance and image enhancing drugs being used. But just some of the challenges that get thrown up by this area. And it came up this morning, and it was so interesting to hear particularly the cycling debate, because there is a real proportionality issue here. When I educate the England elite team, you can see there on the right-hand side, that's their performance base. It is state-of-the-art facility with weight training, indoor gym facility, very nice lecture theatre, and I can go through the clean sport curriculum that no doubt you're all very familiar with, supplements, medications, whereabouts, etc., etc. Then if I compare that to what is on the left-hand side, which a lot of clubs in our country, that's where they play out of. It's a shed in the middle of a field. To try and extrapolate anti-doping into their worlds and their environments is extremely complicated. Talking to them about TUEs and testing and violations, it doesn't necessarily translate well into language that they feel comfortable with. And I think this is one of the things that our Nados and our sports bodies have been wrestling with for a significant period of time. And I've titled this slide as "We all play with the same ball and we all follow the same rules." But is that entirely true? And we've run quite a few programs at the RFU with videos by our elite sports men and women to try and promote clean sport at the lower levels. But it's an extremely difficult issue to try and run. And I think one of the problems is here. So as I say, we've got a fantastic Nardo, and you're going to hear from a member of our Nardo a little bit later. Excellent core influencer documents, educational programs that they assist us with. But when you really start to look at them, actually, a lot of the time, they don't mention recreational athletes. They only really talk about the journey from beginner, gifted and elite, right up to performance sport. So educating your recreational athletes actually rarely forms part of the sort of core documents and the suite of documents that a Nardo like UK Anti-Doping give to the sports. And I mean, I've put it up there as my point too. Education to recreational athletes is not an easy thing to get right. It is not an easy thing to pitch to clubs. Some clubs aren't necessarily interested. Some don't see it as relevant to them. We have a high number of violations amongst our recreational sport, as I said. So I am able to get a little bit of leverage over our clubs in this regard. I just wanted to share with you a couple of quotes that I've had from recreational players. And I think probably one of the things that for me really brings this home is the way the regulations were drafted. It's very much aimed at elite sport. Our UK national anti-doping policy, it begins with doping is cheating. But when you start actually speaking to athletes in the environment, in a recreational setting, and they talk about doping offences, they talk about violations that they're aware of or people they know that have done it, you get a very much a sense that actually the image and performance enhancing drug use has very little necessarily to do with performance. And I've put a quote up there about being injured, feeling low, feeling away from the training environment. And I think probably an aspect that I'm not necessarily trained to deal with is the mental health side of why players use these drugs and how they feel about these drugs. So here are my recommendations, certainly from an RFU perspective, as someone who's run plenty of sessions in our community environment. I sincerely recommend that sports and Nados go out and talk to your recreational players. We do this at the RFU a lot. We make far too many assumptions about what players think. We run surveys, but we don't actually go and speak to the individuals and get a real sense of how they feel about this problem, whether they feel it needs to be addressed at a fundamental level in terms of the education they receive, whether getting a leaflet or an app is necessarily the right way for them. And when you educate to recreational athletes, and UKAD give us a lot of support on this, but it needs to be, I think, much further up the approach in terms of what we talk about from an educational perspective. You need to be open with your athletes. There's no use telling them that they'll be tested every week. We know that's not true. You need to find people who deliver the sessions that genuinely care about the players and the participants. If your sport is cycling and you love cycling, it's not always easy to come and then parachute that person into a rugby union setting necessarily, because when you talk about this, you've got to convey a real passion for the sport and how you feel about it. And I think probably the last thing I wanted to mention is you can't condescend or patronize these guys. They know that you won't be testing them. So a couple of things that I've done that I think probably, well, hopefully they work in a recreational club setting. Engage the club, get someone in the club who can lead on anti-doping, offer advice on local mental health, job facilities, because a lot of the time players are looking for guidance, signpost to drug and alcohol awareness, know some of the club issues, and things that can probably in a recreational setting be avoided. You don't need to necessarily focus too much on the damage to health. They know what they're doing. TUEs can lead to a great deal of confusion, medications, etc. So I think you can offer to recreational athletes a really good suite of information and steer them more towards making healthy choices rather than sort of the big stick which represents anti-doping as such. Hopefully I've stuck within my 10 minutes, Mike. Thank you all for listening.
Right, unmute.
I think most people would call the Rugby Football Union a very well-funded NGB, but in the COVID days, that's probably quite a challenge for every sport organisation. I'm not sure UCAD would thank you for calling them fantastically well-funded. In the next funding round, that might well come back and haunt somebody. But you made a really nice bridge there. Thank you very much from the morning to the afternoon. And now we're going to move over directly to a couple of Nardos to hear their views. So it's my pleasure then to welcome to the microphone Dr. Lucienne Attard from the Maltese Anti-Doping Authority.
Thank you, Professor McNamee, for the introduction. Let me start by sharing a bit with you my background. I'm a sports physician by training, and I have been the chairperson of the Maltese Nados since 2013, which is actually just 1 year after it was set up. I also chair for the past 4 years the Council of Europe TDO Educational Group, and the work of this group over the past 3 years approximately was focused a lot on assisting WADA with the formulation of the international standard for education. However, we also look at, we're also working on how the state parties can implement anti-doping education to other groups and populations which are not mandated by the WADA code and the ISC. So like children, for example. So we're also looking at that. Now, unfortunately, I could not be present for this morning's session, so I did not know where the discussion of definition of recreational sport went. What I can tell you is that from our NADO, which is very small NADO, from a very small country, the line where recreational sport and athlete is cut is really quite simple. Athletes who take part in competitive sport, which is organized under the auspices of a federation or the local associations, that falls, we consider that not to be recreational. So these athletes are bound by anti-doping regulations. For us, the recreational athlete is those athletes who go to gyms to improve their fitness or their physique. The recreational runners, for example, who are out running on the roads. So in a way, that is really a simple definition. However, there is no doubt that the use of prohibited drugs in recreational sport and also at sporting facilities is widespread. Just a visit to any gym, you will see most of the women training at the cardio section, while a huge number of men would be doing resistance training, weight training, and no doubt improvement of aesthetics and their appearance is a prime motivator for these kind of workouts. And this is where the temptation to help it along with drugs comes in. And sometimes this use is fueled by stories and scandals of doping in the competitive sports world. So of course, something spills over from competitive doping into recreational sport. The questions that we're discussing, I think here is, what is the role of Nados in preventing doping in recreational sport? Should it be the Nados' responsibility in addition to their responsibility to competitive sport and athletes? Can and should Nados take on this role? Now, Nados come in all shapes and sizes. There are a number of Nados around the world that are considered as leaders in the anti-doping world and have enormous resources for their use. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are the small Nados, which have a limited budget and limited human resources and who have to manage their anti-doping program according to these limitations. I come from one of these very small Nados, and I can give my perspective on Nados and recreational sport from the point of view of small Nados with limited resources. From our NADO so far, we have not engaged in any way with recreation athletes and facilities. And basically there are two reasons. So the first one is that our operation is regulated by anti-doping legislation, which does not in any way include recreational sport. And therefore it is not the Nados' jurisdiction to do that. However, if it was our jurisdiction, our second limitation would have been the limited funding available to our NADO. At the moment, our priority is for competitive sport, and recreational sport would have fallen on a much, much lower scale because it is already quite a job to keep up with being compliant with the WADA code and WADA regulations and doing a good job with the competitive sport. So those are two very real limitations that we are facing. However, there is crossover at some point. For example, let's take our marathon. We have a marathon every year held in Malta, which we get a lot of foreign athletes as well, but which a lot of recreational runners take part in. Of course, the top 10% of the people running the marathon are competitive athletes who would fall under Nados jurisdiction. However, a lot of the others who are just running for pleasure or their recreational also join in. Now, the question is this: what if one of these athletes is chosen for doping control and we have a positive test? We have no jurisdiction over this. We cannot do anything. There is no point in sanctioning one of such athletes. So really, there has to be, we have to have a better definition. We have to see how we can deal with this. To answer my own question, which I posed earlier, in my view, Nados, from my perspective, should not really be responsible for recreational sport, but it should be the responsibility of the country's governing structures. Of course, from my educational point of view, I believe that preventing the use of drugs in both competitive and recreational sport is much more important than testing. Education is the key here. We need to start educating all our children from early on about the core values that are important. If all schools implemented an anti-doping educational program as part of their curriculum, it would be a huge step in reducing drug use in future generations in both competitive and recreational sport. In Malta, we have started to a very limited extent. We had started this before COVID hit. One of our own educational officers, who happens to be a physical education teacher employed by the Ministry of Education, was given the go-ahead by the ministry to deliver anti-doping education to 11 and 12-year-olds in state schools. So all the kids of that age will get 1 or 2 anti-doping sessions at least while they're at school. And of course, this was funded by the Ministry of Education. So this is where the collaboration comes in. So NADO can provide expertise and knowledge, but it is the state parties which are really responsible for it and who would foot most of the funding for it. Of course, I mean, I've been moaning about our limited resources for our NADO. Hopefully next year that is going to change, because there's going to be an overhaul in our anti-doping system. There is in the pipeline an authority for integrity of sport in Malta, which is going to be enacted by legislation, which will take over the role of NADO, together with match fixing and governance in sport. Hopefully, there will be a much bigger budget and much more scope to do the work that NADO did. So I think, Mike, I told you that my presentation was pretty short. That is my view on how I see the role of NADOs in recreational sport. I didn't take up all of my 10 minutes. I hope you're happy with that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lucienne. I think there's some nice overlaps with Stephen's presentation and some possible tensions, but you can see that we're trying to work through what are the relationships between a national governing body and the NADO. And we've gone north of Europe and south of Europe in NADO, but we've also gone smaller and larger, maybe financially constrained, not quite so financially constrained. We have Herman Ram, perhaps to give us a different NADO perspective from Europe. Herman, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Let me share this with you. I hope you see it on your screen, but before I go to my presentation, there is a clear distinction between recreational athletes who are under the rules of the code and those who are not. In the Netherlands, about 2.5 million people go to gyms to work out, to do fitness. A lot of them, actually about 8%, use doping, but they are not under the under the code, not under anti-doping rules. So the only thing we do there and want to do there is education. But now I want to concentrate on that other group, the group who is still recreational, but falls under the code. And until today, it's a one-size-fits-all. You're under the code or you're not. And if you are under the code, all the rules apply to you the very same as they do to elite athletes. Well, that's going to change on the 1st of January. And I have a very simple presentation, no pictures, no graphics, not even cartoons actually. And I concentrate on basically the definition. And I have to start with the definition of an athlete. And the core business is that anti-doping organizations themselves, both international federations and Nados, define who are their athletes. As a consequence, this is different from country to country. In some countries, the definition means that there's a large group of athletes who are supposed to be national or international level athletes. In other countries, it can be more restricted, but that differs from country to country. I think it's important to keep that in mind. I come back to that a little bit later. But there's the new guy or the new girl who is the recreational athlete. That's a completely different ballgame. And it cannot be the same. You are either an athlete or you're a recreational athlete. You cannot be the same, both at the same time. And the definition of the recreational athlete is quite funny and quite strange, actually. Because basically it says, whoever is a national athlete is not a recreational athlete. So as long as you are not a national athlete, you may be a recreational athlete. It's a negative kind of definition. As a consequence, athletes basically should be aware that under certain circumstances, they end up being a national level athlete, which may not be their intention at all. For instance, and it happens a lot, a recreational athlete may have a chance to compete on the national level in, for instance, a national cup competition or whatever, by chance. They happen to be around, someone is injured, and they enter into the competition. They're happy, it's great to work on the highest level, but the consequence is that they change their status from recreational athlete to national level athlete. And it has a lot of consequences. And most of them will not understand it. The main thing, the main consequence being that the sanctions for recreational athletes will be starting next year much lower than the sanctions for national level athletes. So the consequences of doing that are quite big. And how can we inform the athletes about that? That's not very easy. You basically should have to warn whoever comes to the highest level by chance, be aware. From now on, you are under other rules. The consequences are big. But how could we do that? We don't know who will be on the national level. Only afterwards we learn about it. So the distinction is crucial, but it's very hard to keep, let's say, a very close border between the two groups. Also because, and then I go to my next slide, the definition refers to the International Standard for Testing and Investigations. And there is a very interesting passage, I underlined it, which refers to the finite resources of anti-doping organizations. Which is very interesting because never in the code you find this reference, nowhere. The code supposes that we all have enough money. Whether it's Malta or the Netherlands or the US or the UK or wherever, we are all supposed to have enough money to do the job. But now, in this case, the definition makes it very clear that you can limit the number of athletes that you work for, and those are the athletes, usually the national level athletes, because you do not have enough money to do this unlimited. And that becomes very interesting in the sense of the consequences for the recreational athlete as well, because this means, in my opinion, if you get more money, you don't use that money to start testing recreational athletes. No, you expand the group of national level athletes, or you do more testing per person. So a consequence of this definition, you might say, in my opinion at least, is that testing is not the way to go for recreational athletes, or at least they should not be targeted. I don't say that recreational athletes should not be tested. I think testing can be unavoidable, can even be necessary. But the consequence of the definition in the codes are that you should not, let's say, make a specific testing program for recreational athletes, because that would be contradictory to the definition of recreational athletes. They are subject to the same rules, but they should not be subject to the same testing regime. On the contrary, if you can avoid actually testing recreational athletes, generally speaking, that's a good thing. And I can assure you that national anti-doping organizations are happy about this distinction. We don't know how it will work out, but the fact that there will be a distinction between national level athletes and recreational athletes is great. We have all processed numerous cases which did not make us happy. And the extreme example this morning of an 80-year-old woman who was sanctioned is a disaster. It's a nightmare. No one wants to have such a case. It doesn't bring us anything. So if we get a tool to avoid that kind of situations, we certainly will use that tool. And the tool is this definition of the recreational athlete. So WADA basically, maybe consciously, maybe not, I don't know, have excluded recreational athletes from target testing. Again, target testing is not the way to go. Testing certainly can be necessary and unavoidable, because usually, especially in for instance, team sports, you use a draw to define who will be tested. And that draw does not make any distinction. So the effect of drawing is that there may be a recreational athlete come for testing. And there can be other situations, health reasons, for instance, which also will lead to testing for recreational athletes. But again, that should not be the core approach. And the consequences, thank God, are not as harsh and not as final as the consequences for national level athletes. So what's left for the recreational athletes is education. And I'm not the first to say it, and I think we all agree on it. Education is the main tool we should use, we Nados should use for recreational athletes. That's what it's about. And we do that also for those recreational athletes who are not under the code. We have educational programs for them as well, but certainly also for the recreational athletes who are under the code. And most of them will never be confronted with any testing. So, and I agree completely with Lucien, the consequence is that you have a different approach, a different content of your education when it concerns recreational athletes. That basically is what I wanted to say. So I keep it to this, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. I'm absolutely certain there's going to be questions. What's really nice is that there's a sort of shared space of problems and priorities. What's less clear is what shape the priorities should take, what shape or form the education should take, which features it ought to focus on or down focus on. And I'm sure I'm going to bring back Stephen in there when he talked about what he has on his do's and don'ts list. Okay, I think I'll just go straight to you, Stephen. You gave us a fairly clear idea of how you're going to configure that education. You speak to, obviously, to UCAD, the relevant Nardo. What do you say about the program that you've adopted, and is it different from other sports within the Nardos?
I think it probably is. So to put what we do into some context, I fairly regularly, unfortunately, receive issues from our community clubs. So these could be, everybody is recreational, there's nobody being paid even on a semi-professional basis, about drug use in general within the club, and it tends to focus on illicit drug use. So a lot of the queries I get are about cannabis or cocaine being taken in a social setting, perhaps after a fixture. So when I come to do a talk or we deliver something to the club, we have to pitch it right. And you can't necessarily storm in saying, you absolutely can't do this. We don't want anybody ever doing this because you'll be subject to police enforcement and we'll have the testers here. The players you're talking to know that's not true. So you have to try and get onto their level. You have to try and talk to them about the harm they're doing to their own club. So from one of my examples I use with players is, if you take recreational drugs in your club and the police find out about that, it potentially means the bar license could be removed from the club, and that means you've got no club left. Think about the damage you do to the reputation rather than the damage you do to your own body. Now, I think that has worked reasonably well within rugby union. What I don't know is whether that same approach would work in athletics or swimming or hockey, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an interesting perspective, and it's good that we had sort of cycling this morning. We had you this afternoon from a team sport. I'm just curious to see what the two Nardo heads think about this idea that harm to your club, harm to your organisation, rather than harm to your health, as a prioritization for you, a prioritization. So, Lucien, you're the doctor, so I'm coming to you first before Herman. What do you make of that prioritization? Is that one that you would follow?
Of course, as my medical background would say that I would follow harms your health as the first one. That comes naturally to me. But if I am involved in an organization, of course, yes, then the image of the organization is important. So if there's going to be harm to my organization, then it's going to be addressed as well. So you have caught me on one foot here. I cannot really give you a definite answer. I have two perspectives which I look at. But I would say my first duty would be towards health, that it harms your health, definitely.
Okay, I'm not sure whether the evidence is going to back you up there in terms of health education. If you want to say the main focus for you, as you said, would be school level, I'm not sure how effective in public health are those messages to teenagers about their health. Now that may be a really interesting avenue for researchers to explore, but I don't think at the moment the evidence leans in support of that. Herman, what do you say?
Well, I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, but it's not for that reason that my answer is slightly different. Our programs for recreational athletes do not focus primarily on health, but on values. They're values-based. And they try to start discussions with the athletes about what is good sport, what is fair sport, what is the way you actually want to be an athlete, what are the values you bring there. Not connected to any rules, because the rules are not interesting, but because we try to focus on basic questions about what do you do as a person, as an individual, as your own life when you participate in sport. So there is an ethical aspect to it. And health, certainly for young athletes, usually is not easy to bring on the table. And as you say, there's little evidence for youngsters that there is harm done. So generally speaking, scare tactics certainly don't work, but even discussing health with very young athletes is not bringing the message that at least we try to bring. I must add that this is a new development, and we cannot evaluate it yet. And maybe in a few years' time, we'll know how it works out, but we don't know that yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, education has to be specific to the population being educated. So I'm going to ask Stephen then how his messages vary between at least the two target populations. It could be playing level, but it might just be very young players. Herman, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, and I'm going to ask you, if we treat this population, recreational athlete, in a sophisticated way, we have to realize that some recreational athletes may move into that elite sphere. And I'm sure you've already thought about this, but maybe think about how you manage that group. If you've said before, all we're doing is a rather general level education, are you really preparing them for a world they might go into with much heavier artillery in terms of anti-doping policy? So I might come to that one, but Stephen, I'm going to you first. How do you decide your education intervention? At which levels? Maybe you differentiate between the men's game, the women's game, the youth game, and so forth.
It's quite a challenge. I'm fortunate that certainly from a rugby union perspective, our elite game is reasonably well defined in terms of professional clubs. Their obligations are clear under the WADA code as to what they're required, and there's plenty of testing that goes on. So you have that reinforcement to back up the education in an elite setting. It's much more challenging when you're talking about recreational athletes, because you want to deliver to them something that's hard hitting. You want them to change their behaviors perhaps at times, but it's also got to be pitched right to them. And you're quite right, Mike, there is a challenge here with some of those athletes potentially moving into an elite environment. And what's incumbent on something like, a governing body like the RFU is that as soon as an athlete moves into that elite environment, the education's come before they've made it into that, or almost from the day they enter it, they are receiving those messages that doping in sport is harmful to health, damaging to the image of the game, etc., etc. And one of the things I think actually good education doesn't just come from people like me delivering something once a year or a couple of times a season. It's actually reinforced from the very environment that the athlete's in. So strength and conditioning coaches, directors of sport, physios, backing up good messages around injury recovery, diet, rest, hydration and training, etc.
Sorry, the unmute wouldn't work. So to give you a very specific example before I go to Herman then. So it really was not uncommon for coaches at a local level to be saying to players, if you want to get into the academy, really you're 5 kilos, 7 kilos, 8 kilos too light. But the trials are 2 months away. And that was a very common phenomenon, as we all know, across rugby, not UK specific. And so the message isn't consistent. And it seems to be that crucial people in the athlete support personnel just don't buy into that anti-doping message. So it's easy to think about education just for the athlete. How do you go about education for those surrounding the athlete in key positions?
I think that's quite right. And the difficulty for me is we work with some excellent coaches. I delivered a session only 2 nights ago where a fantastic coach was telling his players that he wasn't bothered about their weight and their power and their size. He wants to develop them as players. A lot of work's gone into that in the last 5 years with our coaches, all having to do coach clean through UK anti-doping up to a certain level. It's very difficult. I'll be honest, I would like to see a greater emphasis, and the new code puts that emphasis on sports, that our support personnel surrounding the athlete are better educated, not just on anti-doping though, on the very environment they're creating for our men and women athletes.
Thank you very much. So Herman, I want to come back to you and then to Lucien about this idea that the recreational athlete is not a coherent category. You called it a negative definition, and I think you're right.
Yes, well, your earlier question was, what about athletes who end up being elite athletes? Let me answer that first. At least in the Netherlands, we have a 3-level education for elite athletes, who starts at the level when they first show talent and ambition to go into elite level programs. That's the bronze level. Then they move up to silver and they move up to gold. And we have also modules for all other groups like athlete support personnel and even parents. Our problem is not that we do not have the right courses, the right modules, the right information. It's all in place. Our problem is the basic problem. How do we reach all the people who should be interested in our view for all that information? And again, we have 5 million athletes in the Netherlands who fall under the code and 2.5 million who are outside the code, so 7.5 million people. And we don't know how to reach them. Thank God, in most cases, it's not very destructive not to reach them, but still the basic problem is how do you reach such large numbers of people with a basic message? And that exactly is why the definition of recreational athletes is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it enables us to develop policies for a huge number of athletes who we think should be reached with the information that we want to diverse. But it's also a curse because it makes a challenge which from start on is impossible to realize the way you would like to realize it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to follow that one up in just a moment. I want to ask Lucien something related to that, which is, you come from the medical profession, Lucien. Who's right to give this kind of advice? It might be the case that a doctor would be an expert in health-related matters, but the wrong person to give the educational message. How do you decide who's appropriate?
Oh, well, we have a group of education officers and we gave training to them. How were they selected? Most of them are actually doping control officers who kind of got so involved in the anti-doping world that they would actually like to go on giving the message. We have education teachers who have come on board as educational officers. We have pharmacists, medical students, not doctors actually, physiotherapists as well. How do we choose them? Basically on their knowledge, on their aptitude, and we give them the training. So you don't have to necessarily know a lot of medicine to do it because there are different programs for different groups. As Herman rightly said, the children, the young ones, we would use the values-based approach rather than talking about drugs and what they do to you and how bad they are and blah, blah, blah. But it's more than the adults who we talk about drug use and how to avoid these problems. One thing I wanted to mention is that we kind of try to target all groups in one go. For example, we had an educational campaign with video on national television, and we had 3 videos. They deal with values, and one with inadvertent doping, with cough medication or cold medication. And it was viewed by everybody. So whether it's recreational athletes, competitive athletes, parents, coaches, so it can be viewed by everybody. So really that's reaching out different populations with one stone and with a rather small budget. So we can actually do that in a roundabout way.
Thank you very much. Well, over on the Q&A, there's a couple of really interesting things going on about targeting the educational message. And from Nicholas Costa, we've got this point of view about consistency. If you focus on harm to health, there are going to be sports where harm is pretty well intrinsic to the activity. So that appears to be not a message which is going to fly. Hans Holdhouse remarks, better be focusing on perhaps how they can use legitimate supplements or non-prohibited substances and methods to make themselves better. But I want to come back to Mark van der Beeken, who says, if the most important motivation for implementing the code into the world of sport are the spirit of sport and fair play, I see no restrictions to oblige a Nardo to do controls in all levels of sport competitions, even at a lower level. I want to start with you, Herman. Do you think WADA should just prescribe the position, don't bother general testing in recreational sport? It's just a waste of resources, and we all recognize every Nardo, however big, however wealthy, operates under a condition of scarce resources. Would that be better for you as a Nardo? Just get WADA to take the lead and say, don't bother with testing at that level.
Well, it would be better in sense of that it makes it very clear, very are supposed to work for and where not. But I don't think it's good for anti-doping as such, because there are always situations and positions where testing is the way to go, even in recreational sport. And we have had instances, for instance, in a soccer club on a lower level, we got good information that there was a distributing scheme of some kind of stimulants going on within the club, being distributed in the locker rooms. And we certainly went in there with testing, and we tested the whole group. And then it's unavoidable. So the moment you stop excluding that, you take away a tool that we really need for that kind of situations. I think in general, it's a good thing that it's left up to Nados to decide where they want to put their efforts and where not. The general starting point is that testing is not the way to go when it goes to recreational athletes, but we should have room for all kinds of exceptions. That's my opinion.
Thank you. So, Stephen, back to you then. So there's 2 points to that last message. No, it actually would be a loss if WADA made such a prescriptive directive, because sometimes you want that tool in your armory, but it's up to the Nardos to decide that individually. What's an NGB? What's a national governing body or a national federation perspective on that?
I think broadly speaking, I would agree. I mean, to give you an example, I've had clubs come to me to say they believe there are drugs being used within their club and they want some of their players tested, very proactive. And, you know, they've offered genuine evidence that this is going on. And then there's a frank discussion between ourselves and our Nardo about what we're going to do here. And I think if it was so prescribed that you couldn't test in the recreational sphere, how would you assist your lower level clubs to either sanction people, get rid of people, you know, that those users could remain within their club environment free from actually changing any behaviors?
And have you done any work then to evaluate which kinds of intervention work better? Or is it at an intuitive level?
No, I think this is probably one of our failings, actually, the evaluation of what we deliver. And I always say to clubs, actually, the measure of what we're trying to achieve here isn't by my education session, it's by you, the club, and it's up to you to lead on this, because when I'm gone in 6 months' time and nobody's talking about anti-doping, it's up to people within that environment to enforce the good behaviours and the values that we're wanting the club or the players to demonstrate. So you very much rely on the goodwill of the participants and the support staff.
And I ask this question more generally now. In your experience, perhaps Herman or Lucien, as Nardo heads, have you set up a strategy for when education is delivered? Because often international federations, for example, might target championships when they know people are going to be there anyway. But it strikes me that with the recreational athlete, we've got a rather difficult problem of knowing when as well as how to engage in an educational intervention. And I'm really struck by your figure, Herman, of the high percentage of gym users in your experience that don't fall under this code, but to whom you might well be thought to have a duty of care in terms of education. So if I start with you, Herman, and then to Lucien.
Yeah, well, that's the $1,000 question, or maybe $1 million question. Those recreational athletes, of which about 200,000 use some kind of stimulant or steroid or other prohibited substance, cannot be reached directly. That is impossible. All we can do is try to influence the world of fitness. So we cooperate with the gyms, basically, and the instructors. And we hope that they are more or less intermediate between us and the final athlete. And we cannot plan this because it's too huge. It's impossible to have this, let's say, on a focused way, as we do have for talents going up to elite athletes. We focus there per sport on another age, but basically in a sport like gymnastics, of course, the first education is earlier than in other sports where young athletes are not active yet on the elite level. But it's a huge task. And I guess that one of the main things that we are going to do the next coming years, when there is this recreational athlete in the code and under the code, is to develop exactly that kind of stuff. How do we distribute education to this huge group, which usually should not be tested, don't have to be afraid of sanctions, or at least less afraid than they should be now, and still we need to reach them. I don't have the answer. I only know it's a task, and it's a huge task.
Yeah, nobody's in any doubt of that. Lucien, and I'm gonna put on note one of our questions, Mark van der Beek, and it's been pointed out to me that I dealt with the first half of your remark, but not the second. So if you want to follow up with that, please answer in the Q&A.
Which one is that? Sorry.
So that was a comment to Mark van der Beek in our audience, because I took only the first part of his intervention. I'm coming back to you though, Lucien, in terms of focusing your education about when it's done. Do you have a particular schedule, or do you vary that schedule for sports? Do you use competitions? And what do you do then with the kind of recreational athlete who may not be in these competitions, who may be running for fun, who may be at the gym? How do you cater for that?
We have been trying to target athletes who are taking part in major competitions. Well, according to our standards, major competitions. We give them the education at least before they take part in international competitions. We also extend our program to clubs, football clubs, etc. As we go along. But as I said before, we have not been educating recreational athletes directly, because again, since we have no jurisdiction, then we are more focusing our resources more on the competitive athletes. However, indirectly, coaches, trainers, they do receive anti-doping education. So hopefully the message does get across indirectly, maybe, to the recreational athletes through their trainers, if they have a trainer, of course. The ones that train on their own, they do it for fun, they run for fun, whatever. What I mentioned before, our video campaign, it reached quite a good number of people. It was on social media as well, so I hope that the message went across like that. But we are still in the process of developing our education program and ramping up and getting more people on board and training our officers to do all that.
One thing that came out of our survey this morning, though, from the responses from the Nardo, was that very few seem to be using mobile phone apps for education. And it just struck me that that was a surprising thing. Now, I'm a dinosaur, so I'm up for old-fashioned education, but clearly that's not the kind of intervention that most young people actually want. And they're much more familiar and at ease with mobile phones and laptops. Have we got any examples from there, Herman?
Yeah, sure. We developed an education app quite some years ago. And what I wanted to say is that we also have an online question possibility where people can ask whatever questions they want to ask, and they're answered within 24 hours. And the number of questions through that email dropped considerably from the moment that we had this app in the air, because most questions were answered in the app. And apparently they did not need to go to the personalized email contacts to get their answers. So we could basically measure that we reached at least a number of athletes through the app, which did not need to go anywhere else from then on.
Well, at that point, I'm going to say thank you very much to our three panelists. I think we've probably got a few answers, but raised more questions. And I think with this policy so fresh, I think that's a very positive thing. So on behalf of everyone, may I thank you very much for your interventions. I do hope you'll stay with us for this final session and indeed offer your questions and comments in that final session. But I'm going to close that and thank you all very much indeed before I move on to the final session. And I have to say, this is the third funded project that the EuropeActive and its partners have engaged in, and it's developed and got a bit more sophisticated and more targeted. But I can tell you as a philosopher, fully paid up, that we have never solved the problem of the definition of recreational athlete. So one can just stipulate a definition, or one can prescribe it, or one can assert that there is an authoritative definition, like one can go for the WADA definition for all its strengths and weaknesses. But this is a hugely contested problem. So we have this afternoon 4 speakers who are going to address it each in their own way, and this will be the running order. So we have Professor Askves Christiansen from Aarhus, who is a member of the FAIR project, this and the last one. We have Dr. April Henning from the University of Stirling in Scotland, Colin Allen, the Educational Programme Manager of UCAD, and Dr. Sergio Lara, the Manager for Strategy and Development at the International Council for Coaching Excellence. And it's great to see that particular constituency represented here. Okay, thank you all very much. Now you know you have quite a tight timeline. So we'll be as concise and as clear as we can, and I hand over to you, Ask.
Thank you, Mike. Can you all see my screen? Super, good. I'll do my best to do this within the time frame that I've got. After hearing the presentations by Dr. Kelsey Eriksson and John Gleaves, I perhaps feel that I should have changed my presentation, but here it is. What we are looking for in Take One is trying to make a survey that describes the prevalence of steroid use, but doping use among recreational athletes. And for that, we need some kind of definitions on who our survey is going out to. And anyone who's researched this or tried to regulate anti-doping know, as Mike just said, how you struggle with the definitions of doping, of sport and athlete, and it doesn't become any easier when you add the prefix recreational. So you deal with recreational sport and recreational athlete and doping among recreational athletes. So this is really what we've been discussing. For the previous project, we applied this definition on recreational sport, that it is defined as sport, exercise, and physical activity which takes place in low-level competitive or non-competitive environments and engages participants at sport events, fitness centers, sport and leisure clubs, and outdoor-based activities. It's really almost a catch-all definition. However, when we in the last project asked European Nados whether they had jurisdiction in recreational sport, we found that even if 60%, almost 2/3, answered in the affirmative to this, it was also clear that there was considerable variance in how they understood this concept and what it actually implied for their practical workings. What the discussion we've had is that we realized that we needed to be it was critical to look at what context we actually wanted the definition to apply in. And we've thought about this for 3 different scenarios, and this is not, we don't fully exhaust the idea here, but these are just examples for you just to just quickly run through. So for legal context, which is the one that WADA and Nados work on, that you need a definition in order to draw the line. It could either be for funding or it could also be for testing an anti-doping program. And the presentations by Eriksson and Gleaves this morning clearly saw that there are some problems in line drawing, especially regarding the sanctions when it comes to recreational athletes. Now, as Herman Ram also pointed to, WADA has in the new 21 code a new definition of the recreational athlete, and as was also pointed to by Herman Ram, it sort of has this negative dimension to it. It points out what the recreational athlete not is. So even if we take our definition that on the face of it looks really broad and a catch-all phrase, when we start to look into it, we need to find out, to clarify different dimensions. For instance, the dimension of the type of, we mentioned sport, exercise, and physical activity, but also the level of competitiveness, low level and or non-competitive, and the setting that we look at. So for a survey, we need to make sort of normative, or in a legal context, we need to make these normative decisions on what is meant by low level and what is meant by a fitness center, if that is to be included as well. And then, of course, as we saw this morning, the differences in the sanctions applied for different levels here. And that is, as I see it, what has not been clarified yet. And we clearly heard that in John Gleave's presentation. No one ever thought that this should affect parents' ability to be coaches for under 10-year-olds soccer. So if we look at it from a social scientific approach, the concept that we try to define is often perhaps more implicit. And for our survey, as Werner Pitz presented this morning, we go for a very implicit doping definition, saying that have you ever knowingly used prohibited substances? So we don't go through the whole code or the list of prohibited substances. If we did that, we would probably just have like 5% respondents to a survey, because no one would know what it actually involves among recreational athletes. So in this context of a social scientific survey, respondents answer really based on their own understanding of themselves as a recreational athlete and their own understanding of what they believe to be prohibited in their sporting context. So we don't get the legal side, whether they actually dope in a legal context, but we get their subjective view on themselves as dopers or non-dopers. So, and furthermore, if we go for the recreational athlete, in this context, we would go for the subjective approach to the activity rather than saying what type of activity are you doing. We would it would be up to the individual respondent to reflect on the time invested, the importance of winning, the relationship to other activities, etc. That could be other elements. So that is the nature of the definition in a more social scientific context. Lastly, there would be a lexical definition where one could go, or theoretical could go with a definition that tries to sketch out what is meant in a specific context, for instance, of an academic paper or an argument. And these often also include negative differences to a proximal concept, which would be, for instance, the elite athlete. So in this example that we had in a journal article, a recreational athlete would be defined as a person who is physically active but does not train for competition at the same level or of intensity and focus as a competitive athlete. And you could even expand that with an example that he or she participates in sport to be physically fit, socially involved, and mostly to have fun, and on it goes. But it also shows that when you start out with a definition like that is thought to be lexical or theoretical, you really end up often with an ostensive definition that clarifies by using examples how the concept is understood in a specific context. And that is exactly what our colleague from Malta just did a few minutes ago. So by way of conclusion, a definition seems to remain problematic as long as the purpose and the context is not of its planned application is not clarified. And for the current prevalence study that we are undertaking in Tech 1, we will so far follow the social scientific approach to the definition that I just outlined. And I hope I stayed somewhat within time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ask. Yep, more or less on time. Of course, there are two problems here which are contested: doping and recreational athlete. And I don't think enough people consider doping as the definition of the full, I think it's 10 anti-doping rule violations. Most people just think doping is this one thing, taking a prohibited substance. So in a way, we've called this the problem of the recreational athlete definition, but in a way, it's also at the same time the problem of the conception of doping itself. But let's see how we do. Thank you very much, Ask. Let's pass over now to Dr. April Henning from Scotland. April.
Hi, thank you. Let's see if I can get this to share. There we go. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to reflect a bit on these issues of defining recreational athletes and doping at this level. So I'm going to briefly discuss some findings from a project focused on the experiences and views of recreational sport and fitness dopers, and how these challenge some of the divisions that many of us use when trying to understand how and why doping happens outside the elite sport context, touching on some things that have already been said today. So very quickly, these brief remarks are based on evidence drawn from a broader project conducted with Jesper Andreasen that took a mixed methods approach, including 3 main components, an ethnography and interviews with fitness dopers, and then a joint ethnography of online steroid forums. And this project will be presented fully in our book that is out this spring. Now, in attempting to understand doping outside of elite sport, we actually ran up against several of the definitional issues that Ask just talked about. So 4 characteristics emerged as we sort of traced some trajectories towards doping among individuals who would be considered recreational athletes in either the sport or the fitness context. So first is the dynamic nature of personal goals, motivations, and contexts, which can and do shift repeatedly over a career. So for example, periods of focusing on competitive sport goals can then be followed by periods where fitness-based image goals motivate gym use. Secondly, many don't have or experience clear separations between contexts where use may or may not occur. So sport and fitness contexts or recreational versus elite sport contexts. So many of these individuals moved back and forth between these contexts, or they inhabited multiple contexts and held multiple goals simultaneously. So these would be athletes competing seriously in one sport, playing another sport for fun, and then going to the gym to improve both image and sporting performance. So what we found is that context for recreational athletes is often a question of both and instead of it being either or. Now, third is that individuals actually transport values from one context into the others as they move between them. So an athlete who internalizes anti-doping in a sport context might actually bring that view with them when they enter the gym. Conversely, an individual who started in a gym fitness subculture might bring those values with them when they join an organized sport at any competitive level. Then finally, because of this contextual mobility and this transfer of values, there was actually quite a bit of ambivalence about doping, and those competing values actually had to be reconciled within individuals along the way. Now, just to give you one very brief example of this, here is a part of a post from an online steroid forum member. Now, the full description actually shows a trajectory from doping in a fitness context to moving into a highly competitive but non-elite sport context, and then back to fitness. Now, these moves were accompanied by contextually informed changes in his doping views and practices. So once he moved from the fitness context into the sport context, this idea of doping or continuing to import his doping habits became almost unthinkable. Now, doping for him was something that was for the gym and not for sports, even at the non-elite level. And this is, likely something that's linked to broader social views of sports doping and pervasive anti-doping narratives. Now, especially for the purposes of anti-doping, defining recreational athletes is, as we have already discussed somewhat today, really complex. And there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all definition that satisfies those legal, social, and theoretical needs that Ask was just talking about. Now, trajectories to doping are rarely linear or linked to a single motivation or decision or a single context, as we found. Trajectories are actually pretty dynamic, and they can wind or even take a circular route, and they can develop pretty gradually over time. So what our findings actually directly challenge are the notions that there's any sort of single doping route or of doping as a contextually specific process among recreational athletes. So in short, any complete definition of recreational athlete really has to take the both and into consideration if we want to reflect their lived experiences in any sort of approach that way.
Thank you very much, April. I think that both those talks there really work very, very well together. On the one hand, Ask laying out a range of definitional challenges, but you laying out the complexity and fluidity of subjective perceptions of the athletes. And ambivalence is just the perfect word to sum that up, I think. So I'm afraid you've left us with a bigger problem, but that's okay. That's okay, because we're going to hand over to someone who's got to operationalize these things now. So Colin, you're here from UK Anti-Doping, but you've also been working with the Council of Europe. Talk us through your perspective.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be able to contribute to the ongoing discussions, which have been really thought-provoking, I have to say. Yeah, so I'm here obviously representing UK, but also from the point of view of the Council of Europe. So in my day role, I'm the Education Programme Manager. I take a lead on the development of content, resources and methods of delivery. From Council of Europe point of view, I'm part of the Education Drafting Group. We are really a community of practice, and we spend a lot of time sharing. And within that context, I've taken a lead on sharing the developments in the area of education of recreational athletes across the members that are part of the Council of Europe. My first slide really is just the kind of fact that there is a need to develop an athlete pathway, and within that athlete pathway, we've now added the recreational athletes. So obviously that's come from the code. The children, talented, national and elite is a traditional model which we have been working on for at least 10 years as an organisation. I won't spend too much time on this. It's been delivered really well by Herman and Ask. That is the code's definition of a recreational athlete, but I'd like to put it into the context of the work that we're doing at UCAD. So what we've looked at and said, okay, let's try and refine our definition of a national athlete, and then from there, reverse engineer to define what a recreational athlete is. So for us, a national athlete, as the same will be for the majority of Nados, if not all, is that they are part of the testing pool, TUE pool. Their athletes will receive public funding. They've represented their country or their home nation, as in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland. They've competed at international events, but not as an international level athlete, which is quite important. And then there's the sport-specific criteria. So one of the things that we've started to do is to engage with the national federations and national governing bodies and ask them about the level of competition. So what levels of competition would they decide would be national level? So it would be tailored for each sport. We've engaged in the consultation. We'll publish it once we have all the results in on our UCAD website in terms of the level of competition, and then we'll review this annually. So if you don't fit that criteria, then all athletes outside of that are going to be considered to be, in UCAD's jurisdiction, a recreational athlete. And then we've got the International Standard for Education, a new international standard. And as you can see there, that is a purpose of the ISE. I think I would also, probably you could also rephrase that and say, why educate recreational athletes and use the same bullet points? We want to preserve the spirit of sport. We want to foster a clean sport environment. We want to support athletes who wish to compete clean. And then within the ISE guidelines, there is a definition in terms of education. So that's an athlete, typically an older child or adult, who participates and competes in organised sport for recreational purposes, such as being physically active or having fun. Again, from our organisation's point of view, well, it's not necessarily about competition. It is about being physically active and having fun. So yes, competition is important, but it would be your recreational athlete who is not necessarily competing, is going out to improve their health and fitness. So in summary, what we're all trying to get to is clean sport. And we want all athletes to participate in a doping-free sporting environment. So the challenge is defining the recreational athlete, understanding the motivations behind why athletes want to participate in sport. And then from an operational point of view, it is how do we reach those athletes? So one of the things that we are looking to do as an organisation is using a learning management system is to develop an e-learning module. So, for example, we will liaise with the national federations, national governing bodies, and ask them how best to roll this out. And one option in terms of discussion with a governing body is that when their members join their federation, their governing body, they will need to complete the 15-20-minute online module as part of the process of becoming a member. So that'd be one way in which we could reach a recreational athlete. So I'm going to stop there, and I will, pass on, and then any questions I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Colin. Keeping to time as well, fantastic. We're going to move down to our last speaker, Dr. Sergio Lara. So Sergio, take us away.
Thanks, Michael. Let me just share my screen quickly there. Okay, so thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for the invitation to spend some time with you today, and good to see some familiar faces and also to make some new friends as well. Basically, from a coaching perspective, and I'm gonna try and stick to a single slide, so bear with me, okay? The idea of why do we need to define a recreational athlete? Well, over the last 20 years, really, I think we've made some significant strides in recognizing that coach education, which is, who I represent really today, couldn't be a one-size-fits-all. So traditionally, everybody that wants to coach has gone through the same coaching qualifications, regardless of who you coach. And that's where over the last few years, and this kind of crystallized in the last edition of the European Sport Coaching Framework in 2017, we've been looking at this sport participation map, because obviously the needs and the wants and the motivations of different participants in this map really influence what they need from their coach. And the realization has been that we need to make sure that the qualifications that coaches go through really are fit for purpose and are tailored to the needs of the participants. In that sense, I wanted to say that we, when we were developing this map, we actually stayed away from the word recreation, because recreation to us had a connotation of for fun, and we didn't want to feel like you can only have fun on the green side of this map. We didn't want to deprive the athletes or participants that are more in the performance side of things of that element of fun and enjoyment. And really, we didn't want to send the message across to coaches that if you are coaching in that space, then you should eradicate enjoyment from it. But it is clear, and I think in that sense, we adhere to the social scientific definition, as Ask was putting it before, that if you look at the green side, participation really is directly with the priorities in that space are engagement, involvement, and enjoyment. Whereas the priorities on the other side, on the blue side, are progression, getting better, and competition and results. And there's no two ways about it, really. And in that map, as we go up the vertical axis, that it really indicates that the levels change as you get older or your stage of development becomes closer to the elite. And on the horizontal axis, really, it depends on the time and the intensity that you put into the sport, which is really pretty much in line with the social scientific definition. Now, as Colin really explained really well, if you look at this document is it's just a framework, a reference point for different countries and different governing bodies to make sense of the populations, really, and the coaches they need to develop. And in that sense, this map and what this map looks like in reality will change greatly between countries and between sports. And that's why we encourage people to, as Colin said, you have to define this within your own countries and your own sports. What is a participation athlete and what is a high performance athlete? Now, traditionally, that section is what now in many places is referred to as grassroots sports. And I just wanted to kind of to wrap up today to really bring your attention to an area that I think is a bit of a problem for us in coach education, because the area of emerging athletes to me is a bit of the twilight zone, and to me is a lot of where a lot of the, if you want, transgressions may happen going forward, because the boundaries between a child and a young athlete, I think, are sometimes blurred, and that's where perhaps we need to really encourage coaches to think about these emerging athletes, as we call them, as still young people and children, and to really make sure that there's no twilight, that that's still a very clear message that these young people need a lot of love and tender care, and that we can really just pretend that they are elite athletes. And in that sense, that's all I wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Well, you seem to be agreeing with people there where I thought you really ought not to be. I'll just give you a couple of thoughts which might get the ball rolling. You said you agreed with the social scientist definition, but I thought Ask at best said there's problems with every definition, and April at least could have been interpreted as saying it's utterly fluid and is crucially related to the self-understandings of the athlete. Now, that's before I start with Colin. Colin, you've used recreation, not you personally, your group, has used the word recreational in the definition of the recreational athlete. So I tried to photograph it as quickly as I could off the screen. An athlete, typically an older child or adult who participates and competes. That's a really nice point, isn't it? Because sometimes people think about recreational and competitive as if they're alternatives. And we have to bridge that kind of dichotomy here. But you say who participates and competes in organized sport for recreational purposes. Now, if you don't know what recreational purposes are, I don't know who to think of as a recreational athlete. But I think maybe you and April share the same problem, in that you seem to be wresting the definition into the hands of the self-perceptions of athletes. And I can expect any Nardo to be thinking, how on earth do I prosecute that policy then? If a person may simply claim, well, I don't have those motivations, so you can't include me in that list. So this is the way I think we're going to take the following discussion. We've got half an hour now, 4 fantastic speeches. All of them got synergy, shared understandings, but also I think some tensions too. I'm going to go first to our audience. I'm guessing it's Julio Amaral. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. Colin, you're first up. How do you see the environment of athletes that decide to compete in a non-doping free environment, such as some CrossFit, powerlifting, or bodybuilding federations? Is this, and I suspect he means is or ought, this to be out of the scope or in the concern of WADA? Brackets, you're not a WADA representative, and other Nados, I'll add to that.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I'll do my best to answer. I mean, as an organisation, as a Nardo, we only work with the funded organisations through our Department of Culture, Media and Sport, through Sport England and UK Sport. So CrossFit, bodybuilding wouldn't be one of the sports that we would focus on. However, if they came to us and asked for support, we would gladly, help them out if education was required. So we're fairly clear on the sports and the priorities that we will be working with. And because of the introduction of the recreational athlete, we were working with the sports to identify who they are. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, it answers half the question.
Right.
It answers the is question. The is question is, as a matter of fact, do they fall under your scope? But I snuck in the ought question. Ought these sports to fall under the same scope?
My point would be, we have a duty of care to support within the constraints of what we can actually do. So when we have the online education modules available, a sport can engage whether they are recognised or not by a funding organisation. The aim is to make sure that we want to have a culture of clean sport, regardless of what event or participation area you want to be involved in. And in fact, to be honest, having an online platform makes it a lot easier, because in terms of costs and etc., it doesn't mean that I or a national trainer would need to go out to meet that sport. We have something available online.
Right, that's a nuanced answer then. So yes, for consistency and coherence, it could apply across the spectrum, but the nature of intervention might be difficult and you'll be constrained by resources. That's a nuanced answer. Do any of my other three speakers wish to make a general remark in relation to these comments? And if not, I'm going over to ask. Ask, what do you make of the negative definition then, which seems to allow for the contexts that we had this morning, both recreational athletes, examples given, I'm guessing of a middle-aged man who's deprived of his access to his son's athletic community because of a doping failure, or of an 80-year-old woman being busted for doping. They seem to fall under that definition quite readily. Is that a problem, do you think, for you?
Thanks, Mike. Yes, it is a problem. It is a problem because of the extent of the punishment. I think John Gleaves expressed it pretty clear that he said, yes, I did violate the rules, and yes, I do deserve to be sanctioned, but not to the extent that the sanction was given. There's one thing here that strikes me with our discussion, which has to do with semantics, namely that we all seem to agree that we should work for a doping-free sport environment. But as soon as we include all the age groups and all the recreational athletes, can we still say that we cannot seem to say that we would also work for a sport environment that is free of medicine? Because people do take medicine and are given prescribed drugs by their doctors. So, and the problem is that a lot of these medicines are also doping. So on the one hand side, we want to work for a doping-free environment, but at the same time, we want to give access to sport to people who are prescribed medicine. And that goes back to our discussion, the discussion that Kelsey Eriksson raised, but we didn't quite finish, namely the question about the TUEs and whether that should also apply to the broad population of recreational athletes or grassroots sport or sport for all. I think in the comment section, Herman Ram said that is not possible. But again, it was for US cycling, it was obligatory to do that. So I think when we enter into this landscape of recreational athletes, we also have to take into account that now we are not talking about young, fit people, elite athletes between 18 and 30, but we talk about the whole age range, and that age range does involve a lot of medicine that people are taking because they are prescribed that medicine, and that gives us a new problem.
Okay, I've been asked a very specific question for you, but I'm going to hold on to it if, Julio, I'll hold on to that question if you don't mind for the moment. So April, you gave a beautiful, nuanced description of the heterogeneity of an athlete's identity, fluid across ages, across sports, with different motivations in the same person. But what use is that to a policymaker? I mean, that may be the subjective, in inverted commas, subjective reality of the athlete, but that's no use whatsoever to a policymaker, is it?
I guess we'd have to ask the policymakers in some way. No, I do think that it does have some use, because if we really want these policies to be effective, if we want them to make sense, if we want them to be something that the athletes themselves are going to buy into and abide by, then they need to be reflective of the athlete experience. And if we're, have a two-dimensional image, or worse, a one-dimensional image of who these athletes are, what their lives are like, what their training is like, what environments they exist in, how they come to decide to dope or not to dope, then how do we expect them to follow them, to pay attention to them, to want anything to do with them? So in some ways, yes, it's extremely fluid and it's very complex. But then, the sort of next question may be sort of the pullback, bigger picture question that has already been sort of addressed a bit today is, should these athletes actually be under the purview of anti-doping? If, we're struggling this much to define them, to understand how to reach them, how to educate them, how to test them, how to keep them compliant, then is this really something that we should be focusing on, or should there maybe be a different strategy or approach?
And that's not dissimilar to the question just placed in the Q&A about if somebody wants to play outside of that regulatory framework, shouldn't they be able to? That's a question. So Colin, I'm going to come to you before I go to Sergio next. So what would be your perspective on that?
My perspective is there are rules, and the rules are if the sport is WADA compliant and you want to take part in that sport, you've got to play by those rules. That would be my short answer to it. And to also, in terms of the education of that particular individual, is to kind of welcome them to the sport, welcome to the club, and just explain. In the same way there are rules for that actual competition, there are things that we need you to comply by for everybody else to enjoy the sport as well.
So it's a kind of, look, it's a voluntary association. You've chosen to play the sport. Here's the framework. Of course, that's not quite true, is it? Since most of us began playing sport at a very young age when consent wasn't an issue. We simply were brought to those different kinds of environments. So that might be an interesting question around youth and young populations, but your position is reasonably clear. You make your own choices. Here's the game. Every game is rule bound. That's one of them. On you go. Okay, Sergio, over to you now. Do you think there is conceptual betterment by using your phrase, and quite widely used phrase, grassroots? Is that somehow easier? Is that going to give us some sort of definitional or policy gain over recreational athlete?
It's a great question. I have to admit, really, at the moment, when we talk about grassroots sports, for a lot of people, that still only means children. And I think the definition hasn't really made its way down to the ground, if you want. So at the policy level, I think we are discussing grassroots, and for us working at this level, we understand that involves anyone, if you want, not on the competitive side of sport, but it's not really filtered down completely to the ground. I think still a lot of people refer to grassroots as children. I do feel, however, that the definition is really helpful, because it really, I mean, having grassroots as a bit of a catch-all for anyone outside the more regulated, competitive, results-focused area of sport really helps bringing attention to the fact that all these people are joined by a common denominator, which is they do sport because they enjoy it, they do sport because they want to be involved, and because they want to enjoy themselves through the medium of sport. And that's common to children, adolescents, and adult participants. And of course, the relative downside, but this is similar to the point that April was making, then within those broader groups, there are lots of shades of gray, if you want, or in our case, shades of green, because the motivation for argument's sake, my motivations to go out running are very different now, actually, than they were 10 years ago when I was running marathons. Even though marathon is not my sport, but I came as an adult into marathons, and my motivations have really changed, although I'm still in the same green box, for argument's sake. So there are pros to catching everybody within that definition, but we still, and this is where, because again, back to our point, that the reason why we developed this participation map is to encourage more and more organizations that deliver coach education to be more mindful of the nuances around who do you coach, and therefore what kind of knowledge and competencies do you need. Okay, but it's not perfect.
So it looks like you and Colin are in sort of the same conceptual space, I would say. And I think the structure of the sports system allows you to share that space. But there are countries, and there will be policymakers and politicians who think of, in different places around Europe, the recreational athlete to be something like the gym user, or the person who goes running on their own or out in the woods, or who swims in the lake and wants to dope. Now, the challenge for all of us, it strikes me here, is how do we limit the scope? Now, you gave a lovely phrase, Sergio, the twilight zone. And I'm going to put a challenge to everybody out there and say, the twilight zone is ineradicable, because anytime you set up a conceptual framework, there's going to be a border. And there's always going to be people falling just over the side of that border whom you're going to want to treat as the same, even though there are subtle differences. So I don't think the twilight zone is really eradicable. The question is, which is the least worst definition to operate with? I think that looks like the challenge to me now. So I'm going to hopefully drag that problem into a focus on the non-structured sport athlete. So whether that's the gym user or the person who goes off running in the wood or in a group of people in the wood or swims or whatever. And we have been asked a question, and it goes over to you, Ask, about the gym user. And of course, you've got to be careful not to be hijacked by the gym bunny or the steroid using weight pumping athlete, the bodybuilder or whatever. These are problematic stereotypes. But on the other hand, there's been quite a lot of research in your part of the world. What do we learn from it about the motivations and self-understandings and regulation of those kinds of athletes with respect to doping?
So in Denmark has been characterized by having the Nardos anti-doping Denmark have had engagement with the fitness environment since 2003. So almost 20 years now has there been a direct relationship between the fitness industry and anti-doping Denmark. And this was not something they took up on their own, but it was something that the parliament said that they had to do as part of their framework. There has been really many ups and downs in this collaboration, and a lot of resistance from the gym community to that engagement from Anti-Doping Denmark. It's my impression that the collaboration is better now than it was 10 years ago, but there are still tensions. And the problem, of course, is not only, as you say, Mike, the person who do perhaps 500 milligrams or 1 full gram of anabolic steroids per week and have taken a decision to do so. But there are also all these people who perhaps take a tainted supplement and so on, and never goes competing, but they do take that or take small doses of steroids. Now, in Denmark, what has been done is that the drugs that are focused at in the gym environment is not the full list of prohibited substances and drugs from WADA, but 5 specific drugs which is centered around testosterone growth hormone and anabolic steroids. And these are really the only ones that the anti-doping organization focus on in the gyms. There are testing taking place by the Nados in the gyms, but they try now to put more emphasis on dialogue work and education as well. So there is it is a good example of this twilight zone that exists there. Still, the outside the gyms, we as you say, there are people just running in the woods or going for a swim in the lake, and I guess some of our problem exists when some of these people who never thought about competing then wants to compete, as the story with the 80-year-old women whose only reason to compete was that now, as a matter of fact, the competition took place just down the street, and she could just sign up, and there was no one else in that age bracket that she competed in, and out she was competing, and then was tested positive for this drug that she was taking because of she was a menopausal woman. And then if applying Colin's language, saying, but the rules also applies to you, and her reply would be, but I thought the rules were made for Chris Froome and not for someone like her, being 80-year-old and then just trying to compete. So we do really have these scenarios where it's clear, as you say, where we cross the line of the definition, and we see that they don't make sense, and they don't apply to that idea or they don't follow that idea that was originally meant there.
Yeah, but clearly they may apply, and that's precisely the problem. Colin, have you got a response to that?
Yeah, and thanks for that. So there's some really good examples there. Going back to the slide that I had with regards to the sport-specific element in terms of the competitions. So moving forwards, the idea would be if somebody enters into a masters competition, for example, if that was identified by the governing body as national level, even though it's not kind of they're not funded athletes, they're not on a TUE program, they would receive education. They would need to find some way of making them aware, because the principle is educate should be the first touch point before testing. The other aspect is it's difficult sometimes to separate the gym user from the recreational sport population, because a lot of people will go to the gym for body image reasons, to get better at their sport and take part in sport. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a concern from some of the sports that if a behavior within the twilight zone, as Sergio would call it, becomes manifested, and then they become identified as a talented athlete and go into the sports pathway, they bring with that a risk as well to the sport, because they've already got into such a behavior pattern that it's difficult to change. So they may get educated within that new environment of a squad, but they've already been using X, Y, and Z for a number of years, and they've got there possibly as a result of taking said supplements or drugs for that period of time as well.
Interesting question is whether that would count as education then. I remember I did my doctorate in philosophy of education a million years ago, and the famous philosopher of education, Richard Peters, said, education's rather like reform. It's got progress built into it. So the space you seem to be articulating is education wouldn't touch them, because their established patterns of thinking and feeling and valuing and behaving were already too entrenched. So no?
Well,
sorry.
Well, yeah, so in terms of the work that we're doing now, and it does link actually with some of the work that Sergio's been doing in terms of behavior change and making things easy to kind of access, kind of simple to actually use. And I think the more we can use evidence-based social science research within our education plans, the more effective our education will be. So the days of standing up and talking at people for 15, 20 minutes, we know doesn't work. It is a combination, as what I've described education being awareness, information, education, and values-based education. It needs to be a blend. And how we do that is to work with the governing bodies, work with the National Federation to find out ways in which we can make sure that 60-minute session, as it may well be for some athletes, doesn't become 60 minutes, then walk away and that's it. You know, got things like awareness. So, for example, World Rugby use Keep Rugby Clean. How can we make sure that becomes a part of the culture of the sport? And anybody who takes part in sport will see the athletes at the top level, but also it would apply to them as well.
That's interesting. So I really want to come to Sergio to ask about how you want to represent the coach's role in this educational journey. But I've had a direct challenge from April, who wants to go back to Colin over that one. April, over to you.
No, just, you know, that sort of what you're pointing out, that this sort of someone will bring the sort of gym fitness values where they've been engaging in doping behaviors and then bring these into the sport. Is, you know, that can be very complex, but one of the things that we actually found when, you know, engaging with the athletes and sort of reading their own, you know, public postings about this is that, you know, we saw several of them that were actually discouraging people from engaging in steroid use, doping behavior within the sport context, and, you know, saying that's actually cheating, you know, why are you doing this within sport? This is just for the gym. And, you know, some of the athletes themselves actually also expressed that sort of divide where they said, okay, this is something that I can do when I'm just working out in the gym, when I'm not intending to compete. But once I get into that sort of sport mode, once I know that I'm doing something for a competitive reason, even if it's not a high level competitive reason, but doing something for a competitive reason, that was sort of a flip where they would sort of stop that behavior. So I don't think it's quite as black and white as these are always imported. I think there's a lot of variation and a lot of nuance in there in terms of these behaviors.
Yeah, I guess the challenge though, April, is though you've done a very valuable job in articulating that difference, from the point of view of an educator or policymaker, what do they do with that difference? So that's the challenge raised to you by Herman Ram, and I'll read out the question if I may, because it'll bridge the topic. So Herman writes, unfortunately, we can't leave this to the perception of the athletes, because that would enable athletes to make themselves immune to the rules, partly or wholly. Athletes now already bring to the argument the idea that the rules should not apply to them, and that will continue, but more subtle. From 2021 onwards, the athletes will bring forward that the rules do apply, but that the athlete should be considered to be recreational level. and in that way get lower sanctions. So the challenge to you now is, having raised this really interesting and nuanced account of people's identity as an athlete, what are policymakers, practitioners, coaches, educators supposed to do with that? How would they acknowledge it, respect it, and make education effective?
That's a good question, especially since, you know, a lot of the research around educational interventions at various levels are showing pretty mixed results in terms of their effectiveness in keeping people from later engaging in doping behavior, and especially with the focus on steroid use. So I guess maybe the question is, you know, back to, I think Colin said it, that, you know, when you're in a specific context, the rules are the rules. But then how do we make those rules if we're talking about the people that are in, you know, the 5K in their neighborhood, or, you know, have joined a fitness center for, you know, health and activity reasons with no intent to compete? You know, how do we do that? So
yeah, effectively, you've just nuanced my question. I highly agree that that's the problem.
Doing a very good job of that today. So.
However, I'm going to bat it over to Sergio. So Sergio, you're one of a number of constituencies that have been highlighted as critical to the formation of clean attitudes and values, or respect for the spirit of sport and so forth. How do you position the coach at this grassroots or twilight zone level, as opposed to the coach at the elite level?
Let me come back before I forget. I'll answer your question, I promise, Michael. But I had a thought as you were discussing the other twilight zone, the people that are doping inadvertently, for example, or those that want to dope because they are outside the regulated system, if you want. And I was wondering really, and this is going to sound really simplistic, but this is just how my brain works, okay? If we're edging towards a system where, as I sign up to a competition, it could be the local 5K or whatever it is, that there might be some sort of self-declaration form that I have to complete, where if I know I'm taking some medication because I need it, okay, rather than going through all the having to get a TUE through all these channels, whether I can be trusted to self-declare I'm taking this. Okay, or whether with the advances in technology, and I know there are now databases that include all the different medications that are part of the ban list, is whether we can actually, I think they're called widgets in IT terms, where you could add a widget to the registration form of the competition, where people can actually find their medication and it can tell them straight away if that's a banned substance or not, and therefore self-declare. So that's one thing that just came to mind, and I thought I'll throw it in there and see if it's got any legs.
You've answered the question by Nicola Costa in the Q&A, but
oh, perfect.
Just to nuance it. So does that mean when they self-declare, they're not going to get the medal, or they can't appear in any kind of category of the first 10 or 100 or first?
Well, that's really what people would have to think about. What does it mean? I think I've just given you another problem, really. What do we do with this solution but whether that means they as you say, they cannot win it, or that, you know, by you self-declaring, you get a follow-up phone call from someone in the organization to say, you know, okay, let's talk about this, and are you intending to win it, kind of thing, or are you just here to take part? I don't know. But in your original question around the role of the coach, for us is very clear, because whether you are in grassroots, in the twilight zone of emerging athletes, or at the elite, the coach has a duty of care, and that can really be avoided. And that's where I was a bit torn when we were talking about the idea of the athletes that are slightly outside the system, and they run in the woods, or they swim in the lake. But at what point, or at the point of contact between those type of athletes and a coach, the coach has a duty of care. And that's where I would say the problem would start for the coach, because if I am aware that someone that I coach, even if they don't take part in any kind of regulated or organized sport, is doping, what do I do? If I know that what they're doing could be damaging to their health, as a coach, I've got a duty of care, and then I've got a philosophical problem, or even a practical problem, because who do I report them to? do I go to the police, or how does that work? But to us, the coach and the judgment call of the coach is always with the duty of care for the people that you are working with.
Thank you very much. Nice answer. Okay, we have now 4 minutes and we have 4 speakers. So I'm going to give you each in turn, as you presented, a minute to summarize your view on what you said today and what you've heard and found useful. Ask, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I think I'll start by saying how you summarized my talk, namely that any definition will have problems. And therefore, with the research approach, we will have to choose the definition that will make most sense for the research. And then that can potentially be translated to something that will make sense for the politicians or the lawmakers or the Nados, and we just have to be aware that it's not necessarily the same definition that makes sense in both contexts, the research context and the legal context. So that's one thing. I think my final comment will be the one following up from Kelsey and John, namely that we really have to look carefully on how the bans and the sanctions are applied and enforced. Also, perhaps most importantly, regarding the publication or publicizing the bans, because if they are out on Google, any employer who will maybe hire you for a new job will check your profile on Google and they say this person is a cheater, and that may never have been the idea. So I think that's really an important issue regarding the enforcement of the rules. So those 2 would be my 2 last comments.
Thank you, April.
Yeah, so I think I would summarize what I had to say is, that this is any type of definition, as said, is going to be really complex. But that what we really need to do is focus on making sure that if we're building policies around definitions like these, that they actually do reflect the lived experiences of the athletes. Because, without that, again, we're going to run into, lots of these problems of who's on one side, who's on the other, questions of intent, questions of, inadvertent use, things that we've already seen crop up within the elite context that are only going to get much more complicated once we start expanding this into this recreational level. So really, I think the takeaway for me is, we really do need to keep athletes at the center of this, which I think all of us that are taking part in this, that's our goal. We want to make sport better for the athletes. I think we just maybe disagree a bit on the nuance of how to actually do that. And one of that starts with the definition of recreational athletes, doping, purpose of all of this, and just keeping athletes at the center of that, I think would go a long way to answering some of those questions.
Thank you very much. Colin.
Yeah, so the risk of, well, to avoid repeating what Ask and April said, from an operational point of view, our role will be to liaise and work with the national federations, national governing bodies. The ISE requires the development of an education plan. So within that education plan, there is a need to identify how they're going to educate the recreational athletes. So our role is to try to avoid duplication of effort. We've got resources. We'll share that with the governing bodies and find out what, from the national governing bodies' point of view, what they can actually achieve. And then the key to all of this is monitoring and evaluation. So we're going to see how effective that approach will be.
And perhaps something that was added this morning about open access knowledge exchange, and Erasmus can really help with that, I think. So that's something we all have to take on board, I think. Thank you very much, Colin. Sergio.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. From the coach's side, really, it's just really an encouragement to all of those working in coach education, that regardless of who we are educating and who they work with, that every coach should, as part of the coach education journey, receive information and messages regarding doping, and that they should be made aware that, again, regardless of where they coach and who they coach, there's always that duty of care to keep your eyes open and your ears open to make sure that you are there to support the athletes, really, and to encourage them to stay away from it, but also when they are already there, to support them in what to do next.
Thank you very much. So it falls on me then to thank all the speakers of this session, which is Ask, April, Sergio and Colin. Thank you very much for your contributions and for the excellent discussion. Thanks too to Herman and Lucian and Stephen for the first session. I think I've worked in anti-doping for a very long time now, but I learned a lot today. I really, really enjoyed the level of intervention, and I really enjoyed the different views and how they were shared in a spirit of how can we make things better. And I guess a lot of us thought about this forum in a different kind of way. Gosh, we can't be there in person. All of the previous forums have been face-to-face and fantastic events where people have genuinely shared ideas in a spirit of tough, critical engagement, but a supportive one. And I didn't know how this was going to work as a digital inquiry, but I suspect next year we might be trying to do both face-to-face and digital live at the same time, because this has opened our eyes to what we can do. But a big thanks to all this afternoon's speakers, and indeed to this morning's speakers. I'm going to hand you over to Cliff Coppins, who is the project manager for FAIR 2. But on behalf of the audience, I thank the speakers. On behalf of the speakers and FAIR 2, I thank the audience for their engagement too. Thank you all very much.
Mike, thanks very much. Just to very quickly conclude by, again, thanking everybody for their very honest, open views, done in a very civilized way. But I found these last hours absolutely fascinating. It's heightened my awareness of these issues. Contributions have been stunning, very heartfelt as well, particularly in the case of John and Kelsey, I think, who gave up half of their night sleep to join us and to tell us their positions and views. Incredible. It's all possible because I have a stellar team of experts on this project. I'd like to thank all the project partners for their contributions here. It's a really tremendous project. I'm thoroughly enjoying the experience of being with it. It wouldn't have happened technologically wise without some people behind the scenes here. To thank Robbie and Francesco for backing it all up. I think as far as Zoom webinars goes, it's worked pretty well, frankly. We've had very large numbers of people joining in. You can see it all in a repeat. We will be broadcasting this through the EuropeActive YouTube channel. There'll be a link set up from our project website as well. Very easy to find us, not a problem. You have our contact details in any case. I think it's been a tremendously successful session, and it's time to thank Mike in particular for being our chairman again and controlling the whole proceedings, landing it on time and on message. So thanks to everybody. I hope you all keep safe, and we'll see you next year, be November.
Feedback
Mike
form.
is trying to say something. Pardon, Mike?
Feedback form.
And there's a feedback form. Please do complete the feedback form, of course, which you should see in front of you. We hope to see you next year, 5th edition of this forum in Brussels, in person. But I think that this has given us a completely new dimension of being able to engage with many, many more stakeholders. So I think we will investigate the opportunity of doing this hybrid version for next year. But thank you again for your participation. I wish you well. Please keep safe. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.